Niobrara's Thorn by Patrick E. Douglas. Chapter 1. There's a saying around Niobrara that every time a bolt of lightning crashes from the belly of a wicked cloud, it's God crying for the loss of another child's soul on earth. People here didn't always think about such morbid and irrational things. Children aren't supposed to die, and when they do, it's a big deal. People notice, and it's at least a topic of conversation. Kids are supposed to live forever, at least in the eyes of those older and wiser. When a youngster passes on, everyone knows about it, and everyone feels it in some way. Our existence, although short in the broader spectrum of time, is relative to our experiences and challenges overcome. Any child that dies young is robbed of those experiences and challenges. For Niobrarans, in the rare instance when death comes for a child, it always leaves a huge hole in the community. There simply aren't that many people in town to make up the difference or dilute the sorrow. When a child dies and no one cares, that's something you can't forgive or forget. And because of it, or perhaps in spite of it, the people look to the lightning as a reminder to never allow it to happen again. This isn't the story of how the people of Niobrara coped with tragedy, but the tragedy itself. It's the story of Jason Thorn, a kid who, like a bolt of lightning striking a gravestone, was destined to be part of the town's folklore, and it a part of him. The worst part of waking in the basement was the cold. Even if he had a decent blanket to cover his tired and frozen bones, Jason would never know what it was like to rise to a new day comfortable and warm. He didn't know the feeling of content that comes in walking to school on a full belly, energized and ready to take on the challenges ahead. There were no windows down in that murky underworld, but he still knew exactly what time it was each morning when his stepmother would come down to get him and unlatch the gate. She was his daily reminder that there was an outside world to go to, even if it was often alien to him. Every 20 years or so, the basement of that house would flood from the rising water table of the swollen rivers in their backyard, and while it eventually dried and returned to some sense of normalcy, the smell of mildew and funk would remain forever. It didn't bother Jason as much as it might you or me, because that was his home, and he learned to accept it. Either that, or he simply didn't care anymore. There were so many other disturbances that occurred in the basement that the thought of being inconvenienced by a simple odor or sanitary discomfort was a joke in comparison. This particular morning was especially difficult to wake to. His stomach was in knots, acidic and otherwise toxic. The pounding of his blood vessels in his skull left him with a dizzy, painful view of the world around him. His lips were cracked and flaking, and his throat left him with the all-too-familiar reminder that he was once again extremely thirsty. These things are sometimes common for adults who have awakened after a night of binge drinking, but Jason had never touched a drop of alcohol in his life and would know no such comparison. It was Monday morning, and he had been down there all weekend. He was just 13 years old when the storm came and changed everyone's lives forever. Barely old enough to be called a teen, the kid would eventually be a beacon of inspiration for everyone in that community. In the meantime, however, he was all but forgotten, a grain of sand in a dune. It's only when that grain of sand gets trapped between the eyelid and the eyeball that it gets noticed for its unique texture. Jason swallowed and grimaced. His dry throat was more painful than normal, and it was always worse when he first woke. Sitting on the lowest stair to the basement, he rested his forehead on his right hand and closed his eyes. Odd that he wanted to sleep so badly, yet had spent the previous 16 hours fighting it, his body twisting and contorting in positions that never offered comfort or respite. His back was sore, and his leg concern for the family. The irony of it all is right there in the name of the town, as Niobrara is Native American for running water. It was a town placed on a drain of a bathtub, destined to be part of a catastrophe or two once Mother Nature decided to pull the plug, and she would do it without mercy or warning. Jason's family on his father's side had owned that crusty house located on the edge of the wicked Missouri River for nearly a century. They chose not to relocate the mile or so inland with the rest of the residents. In fact, they looked at it as an opportunity to get away from the herd. If it meant a wet basement every couple of years, that would be worth the isolation. It was a brilliant way to become the outcast they were destined to be. The superficial issues of Jason and his family were widely accepted, if for any reason, because they were a little outside of town. If a man ran a ranch in the middle of nowhere, you wouldn't find someone from town barging in his house to tell him how to discipline his kids and treat his wife. The same goes both ways. Jason's family was mostly accepted as unkempt, poor rednecks who were just trying to get along in life. Just as the small town found a way to deal with the constant battles from Mother Nature without asking for outside help, it dealt with the imperfections of its residents the same way. There was no reason to get law enforcement or the state involved in Jason's life, or so they thought. They all felt that as long as he was walking the streets and occasionally going to school, he'd be fine. Even in the summer, when he stopped going to school and vanished from their daily lives, they didn't worry about him. He was probably just getting on with his destiny as a country boy. The walk to school was very difficult for Jason. His muscles weren't developing the way they should in a child his age, and he struggled to fight off cramps and exhaustion on those walks, especially in the morning. At school, he knew he would get a snack from his teacher and drinks from the water fountain. It would be his only real food and water during the day. This wasn't the kind of situation where he would get a free lunch for being in a low-income family. It just wasn't how things operated in the tiny town. He was starving most times, but it was never a source of conversation where he would ask for or receive a warm meal or someone's sandwich at lunch. It was another unfortunate oversight on the part of those closest to Jason during those tumultuous days. Missing any school days meant missing out on those key primary sources of nourishment in whatever small treat he received. He always lost valuable weight in the summer. The family home was as far north of Niobrara you could get without actually floating in the water or hitting the banks of the South Dakota on the other side. The mile he had to walk to school each morning brought him through a wooded tree line and across Elm Street. The biggest problem wasn't getting chased off by cattle or the landowner. It was being harassed by stray dogs, a few in particular. A pack of abandoned canines were living in a den, most believed to be located in the woods near the walking bridge at the confluence of the rivers. Jason would often see them scrambling through the fields, presumably looking for food. The dogs stayed away from town for the most part for fear of traffic, especially concerning the highway that ran through the center of town. Locals hated those dogs and were in the process of looking at ways of either trapping and drowning the critters, poisoning them, or rounding up some of the best shots in town and taking them out with rifles where they bedded down. The ground was especially soggy that morning as he walked through the field, and his shoes were caked with mud, making it a relatively slow trek across the terrain. He noticed something shiny in an area of weeds where the tall grasses had been parted ever so slightly. Investigating the spot, he came upon a cat that had met an unfortunate demise at the hands of something obviously much larger. It was wearing a pink collar with a tiny star-shaped gold-leafed pendant on it. Jason knelt by the cat and brushed his hands over its fuzzy brown ear. It was as depressing a sight he could remember. He cupped the cat's head in his hands and faced it towards him, perhaps in a last hope that it would somehow wriggle to life and run off. Looking at the injury it had sustained, it was obvious that wasn't going to happen. "Poor thing," Jason muttered to himself. "Probably those darn dogs." Jason imagined somewhere in Niobrara a family was waking up, wondering where their kitty was. Maybe they were at that very moment searching the neighborhood for it, calling its name and making weird noises with their mouths. This creature was loved by someone. Its collar was more valuable than the clothes on his back. He stared at its gross, lifeless body and imagined what it might be like if someone stumbled upon his body in the same condition. Would they reflect on his life? Would they miss him? He was saddened by the cat's state and wondered if he could have prevented its death had he been there when it was attacked by another animal. Would someone even care about what-ifs if they found Jason lying in a field somewhere? He didn't think so. He heard a distant rustling through some dried weeds and looked up at the tree line that he had been walking towards before he spotted the cat. An inquisitive and very dirty Malamute stared at him, unaggressive but curious. The two made eye contact for quite some time as Jason tried to figure out if the dog was sizing him up or just passing through. The boy whistled a friendly cadence and the dog cocked its head to the side, and it was then that he noticed as it wagged its tail back and forth for a few times. In a blast of energy, the dog ran at Jason, its tongue flapping as it hung out of the side of its mouth. Jason's heart raced, but he stood firm. He didn't trust the stray dogs, but knew better than to run from them. He wasn't strong and certainly wasn't fast enough to do anything about it. The dog scurried up to Jason, getting within 4 feet of him before it immediately and without provocation bared its teeth. Dogs, especially ones that are used to having to fight for every morsel of food, don't take too kindly to strangers hovering around a fresh kill. Jason closed his eyes and didn't move a muscle. He could feel the snout of the dog as it cautiously sniffed his leg. Even someone who welcomes death doesn't necessarily greet it with a smile and open arms when it appears to come, especially when it has such large teeth. Just as Jason began to tremble from the unknown intentions of the dog, he heard another dog bark in the trees where he originally saw the Malamute. Jason opened his eyes and remaining frozen, saw a scraggly pit bull slowly walking its way out of the trees. Jason could see a large scar on the dog's face as it appeared to only have one eye. It sneered and let out a ferocious bark, which seemed like a call to the Malamute as it grabbed the cat carcass and immediately ran to the scarred beast. "Oh, great," Jason mumbled. He knew that pit bull and knew well enough to stay out of its way. They'd never tangled, but Jason was smart enough to know that the dog could take his leg off with one bite if it really wanted to. This was the closest thing he'd ever gotten to the animal, or, in this case, the closest it had ever come to him. He never noticed the awful scar on its face before and couldn't help but feel an added level of intimidation from it. Minutes went by, and Jason stood in place, trying not to pee himself. He was so careful that morning to hold it until he could pee on a bush on his way. It would have been a shame to still show up at school wet and covered in urine. He often used the tree line between the house and the school as a place to relieve himself away from the possible watchful eyes of his family or someone from town. The dog stood stoically and waited for the Malamute to run by, and just as quickly as they arrived, both dogs disappeared into the trees to enjoy their breakfast. Jason exhaled and immediately opened his zipper to relieve himself where he stood. He was let out of his dungeon a little later than usual, and with the muddy ground and the run-in with the dogs, there was no way he'd make it by the time the bell rang. There was nothing he could do about it, and showing up late only disappointed his classmates, who would have initially been glad to see him gone that day. Showing up late would also serve to simply point out the fact that he was there and remind them all that the Thorns weren't going anywhere anytime soon. Jason, walking in late, was as discreet as someone entering in their underwear with tambourines taped to each leg, blowing on a trombone. His sisters lived a much different life and were allowed to roam free of the entire house and never questioned about wanting to go to school. They always headed for the door before Jason was even summoned by his stepmother. The two girls hated their brother for reasons no one ever knew. Maybe they were afraid that associating with him would get them the same heinous treatment, and they simply adapted by shutting off any type of sympathy or love for him. Even after the event, the oldest was the only one who showed the least bit of contrition about anything that was done to him during his horrible upbringing. Jason arrived on the school grounds just as he had every other time he'd walked to school, staring at the ground with a frown frozen to his face. Now that he was entering puberty, he was experiencing feelings that he hadn't before, like being self-conscious about his dirty clothes, tattered and filthy blonde hair, and overall stench. He was embarrassed that he couldn't help any of those things, and he was angry that by getting the brief respite from home, he was only pointing out his hygienic flaws to the rest of the community. The thought did cross his mind to jump in the river after school to clean up every once in a while, but he never did. The rivers were a problem. He might be tempted to jump in and stay in. The girls in his class didn't make fun of him, which was nice. The problem wasn't that. The problem was that they flat out ignored him, as if he were a putrid dust cloud that quickly blew past them and was dismissed as such. They knew he had been in the room, they just chose not to see him. The irony of it all rested in the way people reacted with Jason. When someone goes out of their way to ignore another person because they are comfortable around them, they are, in essence, giving them undivided attention. Every second that went by sitting next to Jason or having him in the general area, a kid would pretend he wasn't there. To Jason, it appeared as if he were invisible, but to the kid putting on the charade, every second was focused squarely on where Jason was and if he'd moved on. In a way, he got a lot of attention when he was around. He just didn't know it. The school was relatively small and housed everything from kindergarten to high school. There were enough students to field a respectable football team. More than 30 players made the squad that year before, as they went 6-4 and lost in the first round of the playoffs. Jason was technically in 7th grade, although he was older than the other kids in his class, and didn't hold the grades to deserve passing from one to the other. More or less, it was just a label to identify his appropriate placement at 13. His strength came in reading and writing, since he was a miserable failure in every other subject. Some say that his ability to read came not as a result of good teaching at the school, but from his early days of being locked in the basement, entertained only by whatever reading materials he could find down there. He had the means at an early age, probably because of his mother, to grasp reading and took it from there on his own. The power to read is an amazing ally when someone is forced into a state of loneliness. "Good morning, Jason," said his teacher, Mrs. Shiloh. She was beyond pointing out that the class had already started. She sighed. "Glad to see you today." Jason briskly walked by Mrs. Shiloh, still staring at the ground. She grabbed his arm by the pit of the elbow. "Everything okay this morning, Jason?" she asked in a lowered and more private voice level. He nodded. "I'm just tired," he said. Jason's stomach was still in knots. Something was wrong, but there was little he or anyone else could do about it. He hadn't had much to eat all weekend, if anything at all. Was that glob of rancid dog food the only thing that he'd eaten since school the Friday before? He couldn't remember. Before he even ate it, he was feeling ill. Mrs. Shiloh was always prepared and willing to give him a snack if he asked, but he honestly didn't know what would happen if he ate a bag of chips or a box of raisins. This wasn't a normal stomach ache. All morning, Jason struggled with gas. He would let a few slip here and there, causing great discomfort to those in his immediate area. They all knew he was doing it, but everyone, including Jason, tried to pretend it wasn't a big deal in an effort to avoid bringing humiliating attention towards him. "Come on, Jason, give us a break," whispered the boy sitting behind him. "That's friggin' terrible. What did you eat?" Jason was miserable. He honestly didn't know what to do.